Potential aircraft Aviation Charlie's current call altimeter 2976, wind 150 at 4.
It's 8:40 p.m. The sun has been set for 16 minutes, and the Saratoga's occupants have only 1 hour to live. As the Saratoga is descending through 2,500 feet, something happens that begins the accident sequence. John, Carolyn, and Lauren have less than 3 minutes to live. It's now been over 20 years since the tragic airplane crash that killed John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn, and sister-in-law Lauren Bassett. So why do we need another JFK crash story now? Since the world first learned of John's missing single-engine Piper Saratoga on Saturday morning, July 17, 1999, there have been numerous documentaries, news stories, magazine articles, and YouTube videos produced on the subject. I think it's safe to say this crash has been one of the most scrutinized general aviation crashes of all time. But here we are over 20 years later, and you would still be hard-pressed to find an accurate accounting of what actually happened. Unfortunately, but somewhat understandably, along with the highly focused interest in this tragedy came a lot of misinformation in the form of speculation, misinterpretation of facts, and jumping to conclusions. And frankly, there's been a collective throwing of John Kennedy, private pilot, under the bus. It's time to set the record straight, and that's what we're going to do in this video. What does the evidence show, and what doesn't it show? So, what really did cause John's plane to crash in the water just 17 miles short of the Martha's Vineyard destination airport? The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, listed the probable cause using boilerplate terms such as pilot's failure to maintain control and spatial disorientation, along with haze and, quote, dark night listed as contributing factors. So was John a bad pilot? Was his training inadequate? Was his airplane poorly equipped, or did it malfunction in some way? Was he careless, reckless, arrogant, or just having a bad day? The short answer is no, 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 and no. Look, if we dismiss this accident as just another case of failure to maintain control, we're missing key information discovered by accident investigators that provides a much better understanding of all the factors that caused this fatal crash. Let me just say this right off. This is not going to be some far-fetched conspiracy theory. I am an instrument-rated private pilot with over 4 decades of aviation experience. I have spent countless hours researching the information contained in the highly detailed NTSB Aviation Accident Final Report. I thoroughly considered every conceivable scenario that might have caused John's accident. One by one, I eliminated every link in the chain of events that isn't supported by the hard evidence. In the end, we're left with only one sequence of events that completely explains why a highly trained, very proficient pilot ends up in a fatal loss of control accident. Now, nothing I'm going to say will change the tragic outcome of this accident. At the end of the day, John was acting as pilot in command. By doing so, he alone has the final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of flight. With that said, it is my hope to clear up the mountain of misinformation surrounding this accident. In this video, we will recreate John's flight path, the weather conditions, and the time of day that John took his last flight. You, the viewer, will be riding in the same front left seat of the Saratoga where John sat as pilot in command. You will see what John saw and what John didn't see. You will be in John's seat during the entire 3-minute accident sequence that ended with the Saratoga slamming into the water. Let's run through a quick review of some background information. John F. Kennedy Jr. was the only son of the 35th U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Most people who are old enough can tell you exactly where they were when they heard the tragic news that President Kennedy had been assassinated. Ironically, most people probably remember where they were when they heard John's plane was missing. At the time of his accident, John was 38 years old and had been married to Carolyn Bassett Kennedy for almost 3 years. In the previous 4 years, John had been working as editor-in-chief of his political magazine, George. John had earned his private pilot's license 15 months prior to the accident. 2.5 months before the accident, John upgraded from his single-engine 4-passenger Cessna 182 to a 1995 single-engine 6-passenger Piper Saratoga. The Saratoga, with its 300 horsepower engine and retractable gear, was faster and better equipped than John's former Cessna. At the time of the accident, John has already logged 310 hours of flight time, with 55 of those hours being at night. John had also accrued 238 hours of flight training flown with certified flight instructors, or CFIs. 238 hours of training. That is twice the amount of training that a typical 300-hour private pilot receives. Although John was only certified for flight in VMC, or visual meteorological conditions, he had passed the FAA written instrument rating exam on March of 1999. John had also begun flight training for his instrument rating, satisfactorily completing 12 of the required 25 lessons. He only paused on his instrument rating training to focus on flight training in his newly acquired Saratoga. I think we can all agree, as a private pilot, John Kennedy did not skimp on flight training. John was planning to attend his cousin's wedding in Hyannisport on Saturday, June 17th. John planned the Friday evening flight from Caldwell, New Jersey to Hyannisport with a quick stop at Martha's Vineyard to drop off his sister-in-law Lauren. The Piper Saratoga was capable of flying the 175 nautical miles to Martha's Vineyard in about an hour. One of the last things John does before leaving his office and heading to the airport is to log into the Weather Service International's Pilot Brief website around 6:32 p.m. The route briefing John obtained included en route weather observations from 15 different reporting stations along his intended route of flight. These observations indicated visibilities varied from 10 miles along the route to 4 miles in haze at the departure airport. Almost every station was reporting clear skies. No cloud was forecast. The temperature dew point spread was 6 degrees, which is well outside the normal range for fog. In short, visual meteorological conditions, VMC, prevailed along the route of flight. John had planned to arrive at the Caldwell Airport between 5:30 and 6 p.m. on Friday evening. After doing some last-minute shopping, wife Carolyn would meet him at the Caldwell Airport. John's planned departure time would have allowed plenty of time to conduct a 1-hour flight during daylight hours, but anyone who knows anything about aviation understands delays are not unusual. There's no doubt John was a busy guy. He's dealing with deadlines at work and isn't able to get away from his office until around 6:40 p.m., much later than he had planned. John picks up sister-in-law Lauren around 7 p.m. and arrives at the Essex County Airport in New Jersey around 8 p.m. Anticipating John's arrival, a ramp worker has already moved John's Saratoga from the hangar to the tarmac. Carolyn arrives at the airport around 8:20 p.m. John has completed his pre-flight preparations and is ready to go as soon as Carolyn and Lauren are buckled into the 2 rearward-facing club seats. I was able to plot John's actual route of flight using data from the NTSB report and from Air Traffic Control's radar track of John's final flight. John was familiar with the route to Martha's Vineyard, having flown to or from the destination area about 35 times in the previous 15 months. John flew at least 17 of these flight legs without a CFI on board, of which 5 of these were at night. John was well trained and qualified to act as pilot in command on a VFR night flight. It's almost 8:30 p.m. when John starts the Saratoga's single engine. John runs through standard checklist items. He checks flight controls, flight instruments, and listens to the Automated Terminal Information System, or ATIS, broadcast. The ATIS broadcast is a standard feature at an airport with a control tower in operation.
Caldwell Information, Quebec, 21140, wind 220 visibility 5 in haze, sky clear below 12,000, temperature 31, dew point 19, altimeter 3007, landing and departing runway 22, advise controller on initial contact you have Quebec. Caldwell Information, Quebec, 21.
With standard checklist items completed, ready to taxi, John contacts the Caldwell ground controller for taxi clearance.
Caldwell Brown, Saratoga Niner, 253 November, ready to taxi with Quebec. Right turn out northeast bound. Saratoga Niner, 253 November, Caldwell Brown, taxi runway 22 via Papa cross runway 28. Runway 22 via Papa cross 28, Saratoga 53 November.
Taxi light on, parking brake released. It's 8:34 p.m. John taxis to the Saratoga the short distance to the departure end of runway 22.
Saratoga 53 November, monitor tower. Switching to tower, Saratoga 53 November.
John completes a few final pre-takeoff checks in the cockpit and calls Caldwell Tower for takeoff clearance.
Caldwell Tower, Saratoga Niner, 253 November, holding short runway 22, ready for takeoff. Saratoga Niner, 253 November, wind 2304, runway 22, clear for takeoff. Runway 22, clear for takeoff, Saratoga 53 November. And Saratoga 53 November, are you heading towards Teterboro? No, sir. I'm actually heading a little north of it, eastbound, Saratoga 53 November. Saratoga 53 November, make it a right downwind departure then. Right downwind departure, Saratoga 53 November.
It's 8:40 p.m. The sun has been set for 16 minutes and the Saratoga's occupants have only 1 hour to live. John advances the power, checks his engine gauges, releases the brakes and tracks the center line using the rudder pedals. Airspeed's alive. "60 knots, 70, 80 knots, rotate by easing back on the yoke, positive rate of climb, gear up. "400 feet above the ground, start a right turn for the right downwind departure. Adjust the power setting to 30 inches manifold pressure. And adjust the prop to 2400 RPMs. John levels the Saratoga off at about 1900 feet and turns to a northeasterly heading. John is intentionally staying at a low altitude to remain below New York's Class Bravo airspace. In fact, he would need a clearance from Air Traffic Control, ATC, to enter the Class Bravo airspace. Like many VFR pilots, John has chosen not to request flight following or radar services from ATC for this flight, nor is he required to do so for a VFR flight. That's another topic for later discussion, but for now, just know it's doubtful that flight following would have changed the outcome of this flight. John maintains this direction of flight for 20 nautical miles, or about 8 minutes, until he reaches the Hudson River. Reaching the Hudson River in the vicinity of the Tappan Zee Bridge, John banks left to a more northerly heading up the river. Nearing the outer limit of New York's Class Bravo, John gently pulls the Saratoga's nose up by easing back on the yoke to initiate a climb to his planned cruise altitude of 5,500 feet. It's likely that around this time he inputs the Martha's Vineyard airport identifier into his GPS. Kilo, Mike, Victor, Yankee. He hits the direct to button and confirms. After 6 miles on this heading, he begins a right turn on course, remaining clear of Westchester Airport's Class Delta airspace. John levels off the Saratoga at his cruise altitude of 5,500 feet. He makes adjustments to his heading to intercept the GPS course to Martha's Vineyard. From the radar track of John's flight, it's apparent that John used the autopilot to maintain his altitude and course. The Saratoga tracks a direct course to Martha's Vineyard and remains at 5,500 feet for the next 100 miles, or approximately 37 minutes. It has been suggested by some that the Saratoga's autopilot is the one piece of equipment on board that could have potentially saved John and his passengers' lives. I agree, an autopilot can reduce the single pilot cockpit workload, especially during busy times such as departure and arrival. In this particular instance, however, I'm very suspicious that John's use of the autopilot may have in some ways been a link in the chain of events that led to the accident. More on this in a few minutes. The 100-degree course continues just south and parallel to the Connecticut and Rhode Island coastlines. Even in the dark and hazy conditions, John is still able to maintain visual reference with the lights along the coastline. As the pilot of a high-performance single quickly learns, it's important to stay well ahead of the airplane. Staying ahead of the airplane means being prepared for the next phase of flight well before the airplane gets there. While still in level cruise with the autopilot doing the work of maintaining altitude and heading, John would use this time to tune radios to the proper frequencies, calculate time and distance needed for a normal descent, and run descent checklist. Although John was not required to communicate with air traffic control while en route on this VFR flight, the Martha's Vineyard Airport has a control tower. John will need to contact the tower controller for landing clearance. John will also need to listen to the Martha's Vineyard ATIS, Automated Terminal Information System, broadcast prior to contacting the controller. John tunes his number 2 radio to the Martha's Vineyard ATIS and flips it to the active position. He's too far away to pick up the broadcast, but at this altitude he should start receiving it in the next few miles. Only, there's a problem. John has made a very small and very common mistake that every pilot is prone to make. He has mistuned the frequency for the Martha's Vineyard ATIS by 1 digit. John tuned 127.25 when the actual frequency is 126.25. Since currently he's still beyond the ATIS broadcast range, John doesn't realize he has the wrong ATIS frequency tuned in yet. The other frequency John tunes is 121.4, which is the Vineyard Tower frequency. Once he receives and listens to the ATIS broadcast, pressing a single button will flip the tower frequency into the active position. He typically makes initial contact with the tower controller when he's roughly 10 to 15 miles out from the airport. The initial call would be something like, Vineyard Tower, Saratoga 90253 November, 15 miles to the east, inbound landing with information Charlie. On this night, John will not have a chance to make that radio call. Next, John does a quick calculation to determine when he should start his descent into Martha's Vineyard. He will need to descend from his cruise altitude of 5,500 feet down to 1,000 feet to prepare for a standard visual approach to the runway. A 500 feet per minute descent rate is a good rule of thumb for planning purposes. At 500 feet per minute, it will take 9 minutes to descend 4,500 feet. The Saratoga will be descending at 160 knots ground speed, which calculates to almost 3 miles per minute. 9 minutes at 3 miles per minute is 27 miles. John would want to be at the 1,000 foot altitude about 5 miles before reaching the airport, so he needs to start descending when he is about 33 miles out from Martha's Vineyard. One more item to check in preparation for the arrival is fuel. The Saratoga has 2 fuel tanks, one in each wing. Like many low-wing single-engine aircraft, the Saratoga's engine only draws fuel from one of the 2 tanks at a time. An inherent problem with this type of fuel system is a persistent fuel imbalance that develops as flight progresses. The Saratoga's pilot operating handbook recommends switching the tanks at 1-hour intervals. Side note, in all my years of flying low-wing aircraft, I have always switched the fuel tanks at 30-minute intervals. The Saratoga's 300 horsepower engine consumes around 16 gallons of fuel per hour at normal cruise flight. At 6.7 pounds per gallon, 16 gallons of aviation fuel weighs over 100 pounds. Since the Saratoga carries some of its fuel well outboard in each wing, a 100-pound fuel imbalance is bound to cause the airplane to have a banking tendency if the autopilot is disconnected. If John took off on this 1-hour flight with the fuel selector set on the left wing tank and waits until he is nearing Martha's Vineyard to switch tanks, he would have a right wing heavy fuel imbalance, and it's very possible that fuel imbalance could cause the airplane to begin a right bank. Hold that thought for a few moments. The procedure for switching tanks is auxiliary electric fuel pump on. The Saratoga's fuel selector is located below the center of the instrument panel near the cockpit floor. Move the selector to the right tank. Verify the fuel pressure remains normal. Switch off the auxiliary fuel pump. Double check the fuel pressure remains normal. You're good to go. Okay, Point Judith, Rhode Island is passing below the left wing, and the Saratoga is heading out over the 30 nautical mile stretch of open water. In preparation for the descent, John starts slowing the aircraft by slowly reducing power, easing the throttle back in small increments. The autopilot in John's Saratoga does not have the option of allowing the pilot to pre-select an altitude and use the autopilot to fly to and maintain that altitude. John's autopilot has a vertical pitch trim rocker switch that the pilot uses to trim the aircraft nose up for a climb or down for a descent. To initiate the descent, John would disengage the altitude hold mode by a press of the Out button and use the trim rocker switch to pitch the nose down slightly. John is probably wondering why he hasn't heard the Martha's Vineyard ATIS broadcast yet, but that will have to wait. It's time to start down. Based on the radar data, it's likely that John is still using the autopilot to maintain course while he descends. From his left window, John still has decent visual contact with lights along the coastline, but the view out of the windshield is slowly diminishing to almost no visual references. In this situation, John would be keeping a close watch on the lights he can see because those are his only remaining external visual references. It's now around 9:38 p.m. John, Carolyn, and Lauren have less than 3 minutes to live. As the Saratoga is descending through 2,500 feet, something happens that begins the accident sequence. As the descent continues, the Saratoga begins a slow, steady turn to the right at a shallow bank angle. After about 30 seconds, the descent stops at an altitude of about 2,200 feet. The aircraft starts a climb at a rate of near 600 feet per minute. The right turn stops on a southeasterly heading of around 150. The aircraft levels off at 2,500 feet, the same altitude it was at when the right turn off course commenced. For the next 50 seconds, the Saratoga proceeds in straight and level flight. The airspeed returns to 160 knots, heading 150, altitude 2,500 feet. Although for the moment everything seems to be under control, John's currently heading away from Martha's Vineyard, out into the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean. And to make matters worse, he has now completely lost all outside visual references. The only way for John to know which way is up is to rely completely on his instruments. It's something John is certainly trained for, but what John is about to encounter has caused even highly experienced veteran pilots to lose control of their aircraft. John begins a left turn back towards Martha's Vineyard at a bank angle of around 28 degrees. The aircraft climbs slightly and then begins descending at about 900 feet per minute. John rolls out of the turn on a 090 heading towards the vicinity of the airport again, momentarily slowing the descent. Wings are level, and if he can just hold this heading, he will surely see the airport within 5 or 6 minutes. But within only about 8 seconds, the aircraft begins another right turn. What happens next makes it clear John is suffering from the onset of spatial disorientation. The Saratoga begins descending again, and the bank angle continues to steadily increase. As bank angle increases, rate of descent increases. John knows he's descending. He's pulling back on the yoke, trying to arrest the descent. But with the Saratoga in a steep turn that's only making it worse, John's now entered into what aviators call the graveyard spiral. He advances the throttle to full power while on a climb. The bank angle continues to increase all the way to 125 degrees. The nose is pitched downward 30 degrees. The airspeed indicator goes off the scale. The aircraft slams into the water, inverted at a speed of 250 knots. It's 9:41 p.m., an hour since taking off from New Jersey. John, 38, Carolyn, 33, and Lauren, 34, all died instantly on impact. Based on the fact that the flight was made over featureless water at night and the possibility that the horizon could have been obscured by haze, it's hard to argue with the NTSB's boilerplate probable cause findings. The pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was the result of spatial disorientation. The question that looms for me is, what caused the Saratoga to begin the initial right turn off course that went unchecked for 30 seconds? Without that right turn, this accident doesn't happen. Let's replay the accident sequence to see what makes the most sense as to why a well-trained, very proficient 310-hour pilot lost control of his aircraft within minutes of his destination airport. Without having received the ATIS broadcast, John begins descending from his 5,500-foot cruise altitude. He knows he needs to stay ahead of the airplane, and Martha's Vineyard is only about 12 minutes away. He needs at least 9 minutes to descend 4,500 feet at 500 feet per minute. John disconnects the autopilot's altitude hold mode. He uses the autopilot's electric trim rocker switch to pitch the aircraft nose down for a descent. NTSB calculated performance parameters indicate the Saratoga's descent rates were varying between 400 and 800 feet per minute. Now, there are aerodynamic explanations as to why manually trimming an aircraft for a steady descent rate can be tricky, and I don't want to go down that rabbit hole now. Just know, for the first 3 minutes and 40 seconds of descending, John is focusing on obtaining a constant descent rate. During these first minutes of the descent, even though John is preoccupied with establishing a steady descent rate, the aircraft maintains an on-course heading towards the airport. Accident investigators found the Saratoga's horizontal situation indicator, or HSI, with the heading bug located at the 095 degree mark. That's pretty convincing evidence that John was most certainly using the autopilot's heading mode to track the inbound course to Martha's Vineyard. It isn't until the Saratoga is descending through 3,000 feet that John attained a 600 feet per minute steady rate of descent. Also, he's descended at a faster rate than he intended. If he continues descending at the same rate, he will be at only 1,000 foot altitude within 2 minutes, and he'll still be 20 miles from the airport. That's too low, too far out. So, what if at 2,500 feet, John decides to stop descending? It's what I would do if I were in John's seat. He's descended a little quicker than planned, and he doesn't want to fly at only 1,000 foot above the dark water for the last 20 miles of his trip. Also, from his previous experience of numerous flights into Martha's Vineyard, John knows he should have already picked up the ATIS broadcast before now. He needs to double check the frequency to make sure it's properly tuned. He needs that ATIS information now because he needs to contact Vineyard Tower in about 3 minutes. He's flying towards the airport at 160 knots and he's starting to fall behind the airplane. A sense of urgency is creeping in. He really needs the autopilot to fly the Saratoga straight and level to give him enough time to double check the Martha's Vineyard ATIS frequency. Leveling off at 2,500 feet seems like a good decision to me at this point. And it's at precisely 2,500 feet indicated on the altimeter. In the dark cockpit, John reaches over to re-engage the altitude hold mode, but in his haste, he has actually inadvertently disengaged the heading mode. The two buttons are located side by side, and it would be easy to press the wrong button if you were in a rush. Thinking that the autopilot is flying the airplane straight and level, John grabs his flashlight and his notepad or his chart, trying to verify the ATIS frequency. Now remember the fuel imbalance. With a right-wing heavy fuel imbalance, and without the autopilot to maintain the Saratoga's heading, the aircraft has begun a subtle 13-degree bank to the right. Momentarily distracted with looking up the ATIS frequency, John doesn't notice the slight right bank, or that the aircraft is still descending. 30 seconds after the right turn started, John glances up to his instruments and realizes not only is the aircraft still descending, but now it's also in a right turn. He doesn't have time to troubleshoot while the autopilot isn't doing his job, so he quickly hits the autopilot's master disconnect switch. Easing back on the yoke, he pulls the nose up, adds left aileron to level the wings. John climbs back up to 2,500 feet and levels off. Now he's flying the Saratoga by hand with reference only to his flight instruments. John keeps the Saratoga flying straight and level for the next 50 seconds. I'm certain John decides to forget about tuning in the ATIS. He needs to keep all his attention focused on the Saratoga's instruments. There are worse things than contacting the tower without the ATIS information. John presses the button to flip the Vineyard Tower frequency into the active position of his number 2 radio. All he needs to do is turn back towards the airport and contact the tower in a couple of minutes. The shoreline that John had been relying on for visual reference is now directly behind him. There's nothing to see out of the windshield but blackness. Scanning the instruments, John realizes he has turned about 50 degrees to the right of his course to Martha's Vineyard. He puts the Saratoga in a 28-degree left wing down bank to get back on course. The Saratoga climbs slightly up to 2,600 feet. In the 28-degree turn, the Saratoga starts descending at 900 feet per minute. John levels the wings when he reaches a heading of 090. He pulls back on the yoke and momentarily slows the descent. Head movements, gentle turns, acceleration, deceleration, etc. all can contribute to the onset of spatial disorientation, and the effects are starting to set in. John's senses are screaming to him. He feels strongly the aircraft is still turning left. He applies right aileron to stop the turn. He's convinced something must be wrong with his instruments. He doesn't want to descend. He pulls back on the yoke. He's still descending. He pulls harder and adds full power. John wasn't past the point of no return yet. Recoveries from unusual attitudes are practiced in primary flight training and instrument flight training, but they are practiced in daylight and without the hideous effects of full-blown spatial disorientation. A nose-down, steep turn, power-on, unusual attitude can be recovered from quickly if the pilot can rapidly interpret and completely trust what his instruments are telling him. We can hear the engine is racing, the VSI is showing a descent, the altimeter is winding down, the airspeed is increasing, the heading's spinning right. We're in a high-speed diving right turn. Pulling back on the yoke in an attempt to stop the descent at this point only causes the bank angle and rate of turn and nose-down angle to increase into the classic graveyard spiral. What we must do to save our lives is reduce power while simultaneously leveling the wings with ailerons. Only after the wings are level do we pull back slightly on the yoke to ease the nose up and arrest the descent. When the descent has stopped, we can add power back in, continue to ease the nose up to climb to safety. I can only imagine the immense intensity of the confusing and debilitating effects John suffered from the onset of spatial disorientation. It's so easy in hindsight for pilots to quickly pass judgment saying, "That would never happen to me because blah, blah, blah." The truth is, what happened to John can happen to any pilot. It definitely could have happened to me and my family on more than one occasion. Many times in aviation, the difference between success and failure, life and death, is razor thin. Now don't forget, at the time of this accident, John has logged 238 hours of flight instruction from FAA certified flight instructors. Way more instruction than the average private pilot receives. I think this accident begs the question, is there something in the private pilot training syllabus that needs improving? It has been suggested by some aviators that there is insufficient awareness among VFR pilots about the hazards of night flying. The FAA only requires a student pilot to log 3 hours of night flying to qualify for a private pilot's license. That license subsequently allows a private pilot to fly with passengers at night as long as there is a minimum of 3 miles visibility and a 1,000-foot cloud ceiling. As pilots, we are often faced with less than ideal circumstances to complete a flight. As we build flight hours and experience, every pilot can look back and recall moments of near catastrophe. Aviation, and particularly general aviation, is often conducted in a hostile and unforgiving environment. Fortunately, most pilots live to learn from close calls, and we become better pilots for having done so. John F. Kennedy Jr. was a good pilot, described as skilled and cautious by his instructors. On this flight, John made a minor mistake tuning a radio frequency that began a chain of events that ended in tragedy. John's misfortune cost the ultimate price, his life and the lives of Carolyn and Lauren. From the first day of his life, John seemed to belong not only to our family, but the American family. The whole world knew his name before he did. But John was so much more than those long-ago images emblazoned in our minds. He was a boy who grew into a man with a zest for life and a love of adventure. He saw things that could be lost in the glare of a spotlight, and he could laugh at the absurdity of too much pomp and circumstance. He drove his own car and flew his own plane, which is how he wanted it. And for 1,000 days he was a husband who adored the wife who became his perfect soulmate. He was lost on that troubled night, but we will always wait for him, so that his time, which was not doubled but cut in half, will live forever in our memory and in our beguiled and broken hearts. We dared to think, in that other Irish phrase, that this John Kennedy would live to comb gray hair with his beloved Carolyn by his side. But like his father, he had every gift but length of years. We who have loved him from the day he was born and watched the remarkable man he became, now bid him farewell.